Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower clear.
But other sightings apparently were taken more seriously.
And one in particular, an incident called the Rendlesham Forest Incident, also known as Britain's Roswell. This was in 1980, shortly after Christmas, when a few American airmen who were stationed in the UK reported seeing a UFO.
A huge, solid, diamond-shaped object they described as 100 foot long, hovering silently in the sky above them.
There is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone, whatever that means.
Understands UFOs are real. This is a technology that is so far beyond anything that we have.
Reportedly appear to exhibit unusual flight characteristics, appear to demonstrate advanced technology.
ARROW is the culmination of decades of DoD, intelligence community, and congressionally directed efforts to successfully resolve UAP encountered first and foremost by U.S. military.
What is up, everybody, and welcome back to what seems to be our weekly Thursday live interviews here on Disclosure Team on YouTube. So thank you so much for being here, everybody in the live chat. And I've got to give a shout out to everyone on Patreon that listens to the audio only. Thank you guys for the support. I really do appreciate it. I'm going to get through some housekeeping and try not to forget anything before we bring in my guest. So first of all, as always with the live chat, please keep everything respectful, cool, calm, and collected. You are always really great. And questions, if anybody has any questions, there are two ways you can do that. Please pop them in capital letters. That gives me, when I'm looking across screens, if they're in capital letters, I just see them and I can star them and save them for the right time during the interview. Can't promise I will ask them all. Secondly, super chat, super sticker, and all that support option is also available. And again, everything that is donated to the channel goes right back into the work that we do here. Yeah, I'm sure there are other things, guys. I'm sure there are. Just give me a second. Well, listen, we've had an interesting day. We've had a couple of bits of news. We had the news that Kathleen Hicks, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, DepSecDef, is now in charge of ARROW. It was always something that needed to happen. It needed to move out of OUSDI with Moultrie and that having their kind of claws into it. So let's see how things go with ARROW. I mean, we all know it needs to change. And then secondly, we obviously had the ARROW website that, I'm going to say it looks like it was put together by a fifth grader in like 2 days, but it's better than nothing. So we are going to touch upon that, and I'm going to share the website and go over it very briefly, but the link is in the description of this video if you haven't seen it and you want to go and check it out. And I think that's it, guys. Let's bring in my guest. This is somebody that I've had the pleasure of being on Priscilla Stone Quantum Witch Cafe as part of UAP Book Club with, somebody whose podcast I listen to regularly, and I'm just always blown away by the depth of the subjects that she touches upon and the research that it takes to do such episodes. So I know that this is going to be an incredible conversation. So let's bring her right in, and I want you to all please welcome Kelly Chase. Kelly, how's it going?
Hi, Vinny. I'm so thrilled to be here with you. How are you?
I'm really good. Thank you so much for being here. Like I said, this is a conversation that I've really been looking forward to, and I can't wait to dig in to all of the topics that we're going to touch upon tonight. But I'm going to do that same old, slightly probably boring to some people question is like, what got you into the UFO subject?
Yeah. So about, gosh, it was almost like 2.5 years ago now. We were kind of coming out of the pandemic, and I just had sort of started paying attention to some of these news stories, but I didn't really have a worldview at the time that really allowed for UFOs. And so I wasn't taking it that seriously. But my family was going on vacation to the Outer Banks, after the pandemic. And I'm really bad at taking time off. And I had a week in front of me, and I was like, what am I going to do with this week? And I had actually seen a UFO when I was a kid at the Outer Banks. And it was just this weird thing that I never really knew what I had seen or what it was. But I had never really forgotten about it, even though I didn't really believe in UFOs. And I was like, all right, I'm going to go to the beach for a week, and I'm going to read all about UFOs, and I'm going to figure this thing out. And I'm sure I don't have to tell you that did not work for me. But what it did do was, by the end of the week, I was overwhelmed by the amount of evidence, by the amount of history. And I just got to a place where I said, oh my gosh, as we say in the community, there's a there. And I was absolutely hooked, and it's taken over my entire life. Over the last year, I actually have walked away from my corporate job. That was a huge part of my identity, and I lost all interest. And now I just do UFOs. And so, and I'm happy. This is like the happiest and most excited I've ever been about life and my career. And it was a good move for me. And I'm really grateful that I stumbled down this little rabbit hole.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you did too. And I'm sure a lot of people in this community are also, with the quality of the podcast that you put out. So what made you start the podcast? Was it just, what made you start it?
Yeah, because I spent that whole summer like obsessing, just going deep. And I know people in the community understand what that's like when you really get into it. And I was just reading anything and everything. I was reading crap, and I was reading good stuff, and I didn't know the difference. I was just trying to take in everything, because I was realizing that I had been so wrong about this. Like, I was so wrong about it, that suddenly I was like, all right, I'm just going to consider all the evidence, and I'm going to get rid of all my prejudices, and I'm just going to read everything. But what I had a hard time finding was like an on-ramp to the topic. There was, I think anybody who's gotten deep into the topic knows how much work it takes to really get deep with this stuff, and to begin to feel like maybe you kind of understand what's going on a little bit. And I wanted to create that for people, because I am so turned on and just lit up by this subject, and it makes me so happy and excited, and it makes my brain think fun thoughts. And I just wanted to be able to share that with people. But I also recognize that people have jobs, and they have kids, and they have families, and they have responsibilities, and not everybody has the time to obsess the way some of us do. And so I was just I worked in marketing my whole life. It was all about content, PR, all about getting people the right message at the right time. And so I really started to think about it like that. Okay, if I'm doing PR for UFOs, how would I do that? How would I convince your average person that there's something here? And I just kind of started from there. And yeah, it's just grown and grown. And I've been really pleased that it's, gotten a little bit of an audience, and that I've been able to start doing this full time. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, it is. It is. It is slightly unnerving when you kind of give up what you've known, because I did it myself, where, there's a 9 to 5 involved and a normal life, let's say, and you kind of give it all up to do this, because it's certainly not financially rewarding like a steady 9 to 5 is. So that's always a bit scary at first, but it's like you said, it makes you happy. It makes the way you think, it kind of almost makes you feel more alive, in some respects. But this would be a point where I'd normally ask someone like yourself, where would you advise people to go to start getting into this subject? But I'm not going to ask that, because I will just say, go to Kelly's podcast for the exact reasons that she just mentioned. But you also mentioned something else there, which I find really interesting, is that you have to sift through all the crap and watch all the good stuff as well, just to kind of find a good balance and how you kind of take on board everything within this subject. And there's an awful lot of rabbit holes, pun intended, to kind of go down with that. But have you ever come across a rabbit hole, let's say, that you've either struggled with or gone so far down that it's taken over for a bit too long, maybe?
Oh my gosh, so many of them. I feel like I feel like if I really just followed, if I wasn't thinking about the audience at all and was just thinking about like what I get really stoked about, it would be all like ancient mysteries, Atlantis, pre-Ice Age civilizations. And it's a little harder to go back there, right? Because everything kind of before the Younger Dryas literally got kind of wiped away. So like there's not much there. And so you end up going down these weird rabbit holes of like channeled materials and ancient myths and like, where it's a lot harder to kind of pin down, what is real, what is just a story. And not even harder, it's just impossible, and I really love that kind of stuff, but I try to limit that in the podcast just because I do strive to be kind of this like objective science-based on-ramp. And I feel like there's only so far you can go in that direction before you're just like in a whole, it's just a different universe. And there's not a lot of empirical data there to deal with.
I agree completely. The ancient theories and the ancient astronaut theory, I've really struggled with myself because there is that lack of tangible data and evidence. It's a lot of just speculation and theory. And as much as I like reading about it, researching it, watching documentaries on it, I really struggle to kind of go there. So that everyone thinks that, let's take the pyramids, for example. People say we couldn't have built it. And I always try and sort of give mankind a bit of a, maybe we actually could. How do you deal with that kind of thing? Like without that data, how do you kind of navigate that conversation?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And I actually do think we could have built the pyramids. Like, I agree. I think we could have. I think what's really interesting there's a couple points with that I always kind of come back to. One is that, just as an example, like, we used to think that the story of the Iliad from Homer was just like a complete myth. And that's how we look at a lot of the stories of, the ancient Romans, the ancient Greeks, the ancient Egyptians, is that we're like, oh yeah, they were really advanced mathematically. And, they knew all kinds of things about science and all of that. And yet we just assume that everything that they ever wrote about like their history or the stories that they have, like, it's all just this like weird fever dream, like they were just making up crazy stories. And I think that, so I think it's hard. I think it's really hard for us to know what the ancient world was like, because then we found out they did find Troy, right? They thought Troy was a mythical place in the Iliad, but they found it. And so I think it's really complicated. The stuff that compels me that there might be something there isn't like any particular site, although I think Göbekli Tepe maybe, just because it was built so soon after the Younger Dryas that it's just really hard to understand not even how hunter-gatherers coming out of like the most tumultuous 1,000 years, that we've seen, at least in our most recent history, like how they would do that, but like why they would build it. But even more than that, the thing that really makes me think there might be something there is that around the world, whether you're talking about Central America or South America or in the Mediterranean and all that area, ancient Egypt, what you see again and again, and at Göbekli Tepe, is that in all of these megalithic building cultures, the earliest stuff that they built was their best stuff. The megaliths were bigger, the engineering was better. And then what you see is like a bunch of rebuilds on top of that, or they built something next to it that's not quite as good, that they tried to make it look like that, and that doesn't make sense. Like, it doesn't make sense that these fully formed cultures with high civilization and the ability to make the best megaliths that we've ever seen came first. And then there's this sort of like degradation from there. Like, how does that happen? And that makes me think that maybe there was something like civilization before the Younger Dryas, which doesn't even need to actually include aliens or anything at all. Like, it could just be that we didn't realize that there was a civilization because it got wiped away. But the idea that maybe there is some bit of knowledge that's endured over time, that's something that I'm actually pretty convinced is true.
And you mentioned things like Atlantis and that, and a potential of a lost civilization. Do you think that holds weight then? Do you think that maybe that, we rely on this modern technology based on everything's powered by electricity, but could there have been something just as advanced, if not more advanced, that didn't kind of slip into the kind of world that we live in now?
I think there could be. You know, I took this class in college that always stuck with me. I just needed an elective, and I took a history of like Central and South America. And what I realized from taking that class was that like those people, like there were several civilizations there, the Aztecs and the Incas, and potentially even people who preceded them, were very, very advanced. And we wiped them out. And there are things that they did, like building a perfectly level, straight road for like 25 miles or something like that. I forget the exact number, but that we would have a really hard time doing now, even with all of our surveying equipment and stuff like that. Like there are these little hints. What I don't think existed was a technological society in the way that we are technological, because our technology requires this like grid-like infrastructure that covers the planet to support it. But it makes me wonder if there's not another kind of technological paradigm that exists, you know, like Nikola Tesla was looking into different kinds of, you know, energy, and we ended up going in a different direction. And it makes me wonder if maybe we forgot something, or maybe they had a kind of technology that we didn't recognize because it didn't look like ours, and we just destroyed it without thinking. And so, you know, it's hard to know what that is, but I wonder if there might not be something like that.
Yeah, I completely agree. It doesn't have to be the same kind of advanced technology. It could be a completely different energy source, that just something that's completely lost to time. And I find that theory fascinating. I really do. But now another area as well that, you know, almost in the same vein that I struggled with more in the past was the kind of religious aspect to the phenomena. But then since discovering the work of Dr. Diana Pasulka a few years ago, and then, you know, having the chance to interview her, which I know you've done as well, I really started to see more connections and things like that. So going back to before you interviewed Diana and that, where did you start with that kind of dive into the religious sort of relationship to the phenomena?
I really struggled with that too. And Diana I love her work, and she's been very generous with her time with me. And she's been a little bit of a mentor at times for me, which has been incredible. But if you had told me when I started this that like the people that I would admire and respect most in this field would be like religious studies professors, like, you know, Diana or like Jeff Kripal, I would not have believed you. But I think that came a lot from like my lack of understanding of exactly, first of all, what religious studies people even do and what that means. You know, that it's really, that there's a real discipline to it. It's not just sort of like these collections of old stories. And I also think, you know, there's a guy who I've had on my podcast a couple of times, Dr. Jim Madden, who I actually met through Diana because they're friends. And he has a book coming out that I'm actually going to publish through the UFO Rabbit Hole, which I'm really excited about this fall. That's like a philosophical approach to UFOs. And one of the points that he makes in the book that really sticks with me and I think about all the time is that I think that there's this tendency where people, I mean, you see it all the time, where people are like, oh, well, like UFOs are angels and or demons, or angels and or demons are just UFOs, right? Like there's one of those two things that people jump to. But the reality is that we probably need to like look through and past both of those paradigms, and that like the reality of what UFOs are and how they may relate to some of these religious experiences that have been recorded in our religious texts, that like there's probably some like third answer that's more right than UFOs or angels and demons. But you have to look at both to begin to understand it, you know?
Yeah, and I think one thing that stuck out to me as well was you have to think about Timothy Taylor and his experiences, you know, a really big scientist who, you know, wasn't particularly religious and traveled to the Vatican with Diana and had this huge experience and things like that. And then you look at Chris Bledsoe, for example, and you know, the interest from that sort of thing. And, you know, add all these things together. And then when I did speak to Diana and she was talking about sort of cases such as St. Francis of Assisi, and the way that she talked about how that could relate to the phenomena or even UAP that was witnessed, it really did start slotting things into place for me. And now I have that connection in my kind of wheelhouse, let's say. I really find it builds kind of on my background in nuts and bolts, let's say, because that's where I came from, and I've really kind of tried to keep religious aspects and the woo, let's say, at arm's length. But you actually did an episode called Waking Up Inside the Cave, and that's something that really blew my mind. And so could you just talk us through what it's about, why you decided to do it, and all of that, really?
Yeah, that actually, a lot of that came from my fascination with Diana's work. So she had talked about it there was like last year in May, she did an interview on Theories of Everything with Kurt Mungle. And I was just blown away by that. And she said she had talked a little bit about the cave. I ended up taking a class from her last summer where she talked a lot about the cave. And then she brought in Jim Madden, who I've now become very good friends with. And and to talk about the cave, because she was, and so what's so funny, I was telling Jim this yesterday on a call, that a year ago when I got kind of like hit with that and started to really think about the cave, I was like, here's the answer. I've found it and I understand it. And like a year later, I'm realizing that I'm only just beginning to understand it and what it really means. But it's been such an incredible, like Plato's cave, I feel like is such an incredible framework. It's like a tool that you can use to start thinking about the more challenging aspects of this whole phenomenon. Because for me, in some ways, like UFOs have almost like become secondary to the thing that I'm really interested in, which is like, why did I not believe in them? And like, what does that mean to believe in something? And how do you know what's real? And how do you know what's not real? And to what extent is my worldview been kind of programmed into me? Not even necessarily in like a nefarious conspiracy theory kind of way, but just like, we all go to school and learn the same thing. We turn on the television and we all see the same thing. Like, it's really easy to just kind of like have blinders on and not look past it. And so I've become really fascinated with just the question of what is knowledge? What do I actually know? And like, what are we? Because I don't think as humans that we all turn to each other enough and just go, man, what is this place? Like, what are we what are we doing here? What is all of this about? And like we just get so caught in our little loops every day that we just we don't think about it. And so I think the cave is about that. It's about that moment where you kind of like catch yourself and you're like, oh crap, like all of this stuff that I thought was so real is like not actually that important. And like, hey, maybe there's like something else back here that might be, and so that really started me. I really used that as a framework and made like a whole series out of it. It took me like 6 months to write. It's the hardest thing I've ever written. It took a lot of research, but it's the thing I'm really happy to share, because I think that waking up inside the cave and started just having that recognition is really cool on a personal level. And it's really, really, really cool when you can share it with other people. And so to me, that's just like wins all around.
Yeah. I mean, you almost said what I was thinking there, because when I first heard the allegory, I was blown away, because you realize that you have kind of been living with a bit of tunnel vision, and that it's, you suddenly like, there is so much around you, and it's okay to not know much about it, but to kind of explore it and be okay not knowing. And I always struggle with the word belief, because I'm always so data driven and everything. But then sometimes, and more so now, it's like, it's okay to start believing, and that will then lead you to certain things that if they turn out not to be kind of the right direction, it's okay to pull back and say, okay, I was wrong in going down there. But you kind of have to take these journeys more so now. And I think it really opened me up to that. So yeah, Diana's work has certainly been influenced on me as well. But then, we look at kind of science and academia, and, look back over the kind of decades when it comes to the UFO subject. It's been rarely touched upon in any kind of depth, but we kind of seem to be seeing it a bit more now. So do you think that this is something that is going to be continued to take seriously? Are we going to start seeing more academia, do you think, working, alongside us, as it were, on this subject?
I hope so. I'm seeing a lot of academics coming out of the woodwork. Like, I'm sure you hear from a lot of listeners, I certainly do, who are in academia, but who are maybe not like out of the closet, because it's not quite proper. When I was talking to Jim yesterday, he was because he's a professor at a private university. And he said, I really had a conversation with some of my colleagues the other day and really realized like how crazy they actually think I am. And I was like, like, sorry you're dealing with that. But, but I think a lot of it is just, I think that you and I see it so much because we're in the community and we're creators in this community, and we get outreach from people, so we're hearing from people all the time who like just figured out how cool this is and like just figured out that it's real. And what that does to somebody, like the first time they see it, it's irresistible. And I just think that academics and everyone is kind of in that boat. And I have a lot of faith that like as we continue to move this ball down the field, that more and more people are going to have that kind of like shake and awake moment where they realize that there is something to this. And I don't think there's like any conspiracy in academia that's keeping people from considering this. I think academics are like really smart people who are just, like you said, like very data driven, like very empirical. They just want to see the facts. But this involves, in some ways, academics are like the keepers of our paradigms and our models and our structures of reality. Like they're the ones who like hold on to all of that while we all just like watch TV or go about our lives or whatever. And so like I have a lot of respect for them, but in these situations where the paradigm is shifting really fast, I think it makes sense that some of them might be lagging behind a little bit because their job is to hold all of that together, not to tear it apart. You know what I mean? But I don't think that speaks to like an unwillingness on their part to do so. I think they just are going to, for most of them, they just need to see more, to convince them. And I think that's totally fair. And I'm really hopeful that through this process that's going on in Washington and around the world, that we're going to start to see that.
Yeah, absolutely. We have had some kind of notable academics in the past look at the subject. John Mack being a huge sort of proponent for the working in a positive way for the subject, but he focused almost solely on the experiencer side of the phenomena, and again that relies more on anecdotal testimony and things like that. But in this day and age where we're kind of really hyper focused on the government side of things and hearings and reports and stuff, it seems that the experiencers have had to take this back seat for quite some time now. But I'm starting to feel like the conversation really needs to be had a lot more and bring it back in line. And what's your thoughts on the experiencer and that conversation that needs to be had?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I feel it took me a while to get there in my work. And part of that, like if I'm being like really brutally honest, part of it was because I didn't want to scare people away.
Sure.
But a big part of it was that I was struggling with it and I didn't know what to make of it. Even as someone who's had UFO sightings and I've had a few other what you would classify as like anomalous experiences in my life, I still had a really hard time dealing with the weirdness of someone else's anomalous experience. Can be like really, really challenging. And it took me a while to know what I thought about it. And I think for people, it would be really hard for me and I had to get over it. But I was really struggling with well, what if people think I'm crazy? I'm somebody who has like my work and all of that. I've always traded on being like a smart chick, and I wouldn't want, it would be kind of like, I know it's all ego and it sounds stupid, but we all have our little like ego things, and if somebody was really like, man, this girl lost it, that would hurt me in a way that goes beyond what like somebody said about my appearance or about, we all have our little things and that would have really hurt me. And I had to do my own work with that. But I also feel like I am dedicated now. I've gotten through it. And I agree with you. I think it's the most important thing that we can talk about. I think that when we're dealing with, there's kind of two parts of this equation. It's what are we dealing with? But there's also the who are we dealing with? What are their motivations? What do they value? Why are they here? And those aren't questions that we're going to be able to deal with in a lab. There is no scientific answer to that question. And the way that we're going to have to approach that is anthropologically in a way, in the way that we would deal with if we figured out, before we were spread out over the planet and people were still, discovering each other, the way that people on one continent would find out about people on another continent is people would get on a boat and go over there and they'd write about it and they'd come back and they'd tell people and they'd share their journals and be like, here's what we found out. And they'd get this little piece of that culture, and they'd understand a little bit more than they did before. And I think in this analogy, like the experiencers are those people who have started to have contact with whatever it is that we're dealing with here, and that we need to deal with it as we would if we were anthropologists. We need to take these stories. You don't need to take every single story and assume that it's fact. In fact, you shouldn't. But you should take all the stories and put them together and then say, what are the patterns that are here? Like, what seems more likely than not likely? And that's the only way that we're going to be able to start to understand what we're actually dealing with here. And if we don't listen to experiencers, we're just going off of conjecture. And so I think we really need to center them more in the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in my early days of researching, looking back at maybe a few decades old cases, and the words that kept coming up were alien abduction, and I really kind of struggled with that. But then you look more now, and the more that you spend time researching, you start to see it's not that straightforward. It's not just little green men taking people up into a ship and probing them, for lack of a better word, because you get to have the conversations with genuine experiences. And then you have people say that they've almost seen behind a veil as well, and there could be some kind of trickster element at play, and it really expands like the possibilities of what these beings or entities are, which kind of leads to my next question. And it's one that I struggle with an awful lot, because how do you go about dealing with what the origin of this potential non-human intelligence is? Is it extraterrestrial, crypto-terrestrial, interdimensional? How do you deal with all of these possibilities, and when things kind of may appear that point really sharply to one, but then a week later something else comes up and you're completely at the other end of the spectrum? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, it's tough, isn't it? I think a lot of it is learning to keep your mind open, and to not take anything off the table unless you have a really good reason to take it off the table. And, unfortunately or fortunately, it's just part of the process, right? Like, we're at the part where we're just continuing to add things to the table and nothing has been removed from the table. And it could be that even of all the things that we have on the table, none of those might be exactly right. Like, we might be dealing with something that's so alien to us that it's some combination of those things, or it's none of those things, or it's something we haven't considered at all. So I think we do have to keep a really, really open mind. But something that I think about a lot is just that the Earth is a really cool place. Like, our planet is good. Water, I think, even if you think about a completely different organic paradigm, or even a completely different technological paradigm, we have a lot of gold, we have a lot of minerals, we have a lot of water, and there's all kinds of stuff that all kinds of people would want to do with that. And as far as we know, there's nobody like us in thousands of light years in any direction. We actually haven't even really found a planet. We found a handful of planets that might be like us, and that's the best we've been able to do so far. And so I think that we can expect that we're pretty special in that regard. And so I would expect that probably the ecosystem of Earth is much more complex than we think. And that there are, in the way that bugs kind of congregate around a light, you know what I mean? The Earth is kind of like that sort of a light. It's a beacon for things like us. And so when things not like us, and so it makes me think that what we're dealing with on Earth is probably a much more complex ecosystem than we are aware of, and that we're just waking up to what all of that means.
That's a really great way of putting it. Really impressive. Let's jump slightly to a different sort of area, and this would be kind of 2017, when everything, the last few years have, researchers will say has been completely different to the decades before. And have you gone back to the kind of 2017, post-2017 TTSA side of things? And if so, what are your thoughts when it comes to people like Tom DeLonge and, the introduction of Lou Elizondo? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I love all that. And I'm working right now on a Skinwalker series that will start coming out next month. That's going to start with the early Skinwalker and then go through Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, which I'm rereading right now, and it's blowing my mind again. Because I feel like I knew so much less the first time I read it, and now I know so much more, and I'm catching so much more. People should read that book more than once.
Definitely.
And yeah, I'm going through all of that. So I'm fascinated by all of it, by I love ufology so much, not just for the history and the scholarship of it, but for the people, to be really into this stuff and pursuing this topic, especially the people, because I'm a newcomer, right? The people who were into this stuff before 2017 and, decades ago, like you had to be this sort of like renegade spirit and like a true independent thinker. And they are just some of the most interesting people you will ever read about, like all of them. So I'm fascinated by all of that. And I have this like deep love for the characters in this story in a way. But I think going back to 2017, I laugh all the time. And I know I love our friend Dan's Tom Was Right shirt. And I got one of those from him because it makes me laugh all the time, because I really do think there's going to be a lot of people made very uncomfortable when they wake up one day and realizing that they're living in a world where Tom DeLonge was like more right than he was wrong about stuff, because his track record, everything he says, if you go back to those like 2016, 2017 interviews that he was doing that were like completely unfiltered and like absolutely off the wall, insane, like his track record has been pretty good for the things that we have been able to confirm. And, I'm not saying I take everything that he says as gospel or anything like that, but I think people need to be prepared to live in a world where Tom was more right than he was wrong,
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I mean, I think he gets too much hate these days, and for whatever reason, but I guess that's the world we live in, and shout out to UFO Twitter. But I mean, another area which, again, will be quite a speculative conversation is disclosure and post-disclosure, ontological shock, and, the general populace, let's say. I struggle with it sometimes because I can't even begin to think what it would be like in countries that I'm not familiar with and cultures that I'm not familiar with. But if you were to talk in a general kind of way, how do you see like a post-disclosure reaction when it comes to the acknowledgement of, let's say, a non-human intelligence?
Yeah, no, that's such a good question. And it's something I think about all the time. And I guess it'll be interesting to see what actually happens, because I think we may be on the verge of that. In a lot of ways, it really excites me. I think that there's this kind of fear that everything is going to fall apart, or that people are going to have some kind of breakdown, or that, society will cease to function. And I do think that maybe there's a little bit something to that, in that I think that society will cease to function in the way it is functioning now. But I don't think that there's a lot of people who would say that that's a bad thing. There could definitely be some turbulence involved in that, having people wake up to the fact that we're not as safe as we thought we were, and that maybe we're not at the top of the food chain, and that, oh, by the way, the government's been lying to us for a really long time. And, oh, by the way, we all bought it, like really bought it, because I think for people who have been on either side of that, like I certainly have been, it's hard to deal with. But it's also really humbling. And I think we live in this world where everybody's so certain of everything, like if gas prices are too high, everybody and their mom for like a couple weeks is suddenly an expert on gas prices and you know what I mean? And like how did these gas prices get so high? And everyone, but like probably like, I don't even think 1% of the population of the planet could really explain to you in any kind of coherent way what contributes to gas prices. But that's like the environment we're living in, where everyone is just so certain. And I think that having people suddenly become less certain and start questioning themselves a little bit I think that could actually be a really positive thing. And I think that it might help cure some of what ails us. And so like, I'm really, really excited about that. And I don't think that it's gonna, like I said, I don't think it's gonna come without turbulence. But I'm really excited about a post-disclosure world, because I know how much happier I am. And I know like the kinds of people, like you and like, all of our wonderful friends in this community, I have met some of just the sweetest, kindest, smartest people I've ever met in my life. And and I think it's because like you get into this and it changes you, and I think that's a good thing. I'd love to see other people kind of come to that place of a humbling and an opening that occurs when you kind of come around to this stuff. So I don't know what it looks like, and I'm sure it'll be messy, but I'm really optimistic, honestly.
No, that's really good to hear, and I'm very much in the same vein. And I think you really touched upon something that I find really important, and that is the friends that you make on this journey when you're a part of this subject. You know, even if we find out that we're completely wrong about the whole thing, you know, people say to me, "How are you going to feel? Are you not going to feel like you've wasted your time?" And I'll be like, "Look, to be honest, I've got lifelong friends out of this subject. I will always take a positive from a negative and things like that." And so that really, you know, that really hits home when you mention that. So I really do appreciate.
We're not going to regret having the time of our lives, which is literally what I'm doing over here, and I know you guys are doing over there in the UK. So, like, where's the loss? You know?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm always a positive person in life in general as well, and I think that helps sometimes, because the frustration in this subject comes quite often, especially when you're digging down a certain rabbit hole or into a certain case, and maybe you feel like you're getting closer to something, and then you just hit that brick wall, and you know that time has just gone. And so, you know, it's always good to try and sort of just stay upbeat and say, right, on to the next one. So, you know, that really resonated there. So I appreciate that. Let's bring it right back up to kind of more recent times, though, with, you know, we can talk about, which I won't go into detail on, about the UAP task force and the iterations since with AIMSOG and now into Arrow. But you know, we've seen this legislation growing through the NDAA in the last few years, and it's really led up to the hearings that we had recently with the first kind of major name, David Grush, you know, coming out of the woodwork. And before that, we'd only had people that we were familiar with talking about testifying, such as Robert Salas, etc., which, don't get me wrong, are fantastic witnesses and speakers. But when the Grush story broke, I think a lot of us kind of took a big gasp of breath, and were like, oh my goodness, this is elevated the conversation. So what was it like for you when that happened?
You know, it was crazy because, I mean, and I think a lot of us in the community experienced this, where this is all I think about all day, every day. And yet, you know, it's different when you get some kind of confirmation, or when at least it's starting to be talked about. And, you know, David Grush didn't say anything that was like entirely new to me, or that was like a surprise. And I don't think it was probably a surprise to anyone who spent much time learning about this subject. But just to hear someone say it, and someone with such a sort of pedigree within the intelligence community, and, you know, people like, this isn't somebody, people act like this was just some guy in the Pentagon who like overheard some rumors at the lunch table or something. Like this was the guy who was doing the investigation for the UAP task force. Like, this was his job. He was doing what they told him to do, you know, and to really hear him say these things, and to come forward, and to see him do it so bravely, you know, with such conviction, and against, you know, this open retaliation case. And we've seen what's happened to him over the last month with people trying to smear him. And, you know, we have all kinds of indications, not just from people like, you know, Grush and Colthart, but also from people, you know, in Congress who are saying that they've talked to Grush and other whistleblowers who have told them that, like, they're afraid for their careers and for their lives. And, you know, these other whistleblowers who haven't come forward yet, they have very good reasons for not doing so. They're afraid. But to see David Grush stand up and to do that, you know, much in the way that Lou Elizondo did, like, people are so quick to throw stones over any little thing that they might see as a character defect of some kind. But there are not very many human beings who would put their life and their career and every single thing that they've ever worked for on the line to do something wildly unpopular that everyone's going to tell you you're crazy for, because you believe in something. Like, that's really inspiring to me. And it also tells me kind of the depth of the importance of what we're dealing with here, that there are people who are willing to do that. But it does take you to this place where you're like, oh crap, this is real, you know? And I think even for those of us who like believe, like you said, I also actually struggle with the word belief. Like, when I say I believe this, I don't know if believe is the right word, because I'm willing to be wrong, you know? Yeah. Yeah. But even for those of us who are pretty sure this was the case, I think it's you get a peek of what a post-disclosure world might be like. It's jarring, and you have to process it yourself also.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to stick with the belief thing you brought up again, I found that semantics in this subject people will pick up upon that small word that you may say, whether it's belief or something else. They will pick up on that smallest thing and run with it, saying that you meant this or thought this because you said it in a certain way. And I do struggle with that, and I think that's something that I'll struggle with for some time. But we're all human here. We all have a certain way of talking, and others may think, just pick up on it in a different way. So I think that's always something that I try and I'm aware of when listening to others. But, we saw almost quite a bit of pushback with David Grush as well. People talk about the body language experts who did an episode on him and were pretty skeptical of him. And no offense to them, gentlemen, I've watched them a lot in the past, and, I always take into account what they say. But, then it all came out about him, his medical conditions and his autism and stuff like that. And, and then we still see people like KK, let's say, I didn't even want to say his name, writing articles and stuff like that. It just seems to me that, like, why even bother when just let this play out? Because if this is just some huge psyop, then let it play out, because the truth will always kind of come to the forefront eventually. Do you see it that way, or?
Yeah, I mean, the body language stuff it's not even that I feel like body language analysis is like total bunk. Like, I'm sure that if you are a detective who's like interviewing people, or if you're like an intelligence person who's in the field, that knowing some of these things probably really does help you, and that there probably are people who are really good at it, right?
Sure.
But there's also such a diversity amongst people. And I don't think that any of us would be comfortable with, a decision being made in a court of law based on our body language. I think we all can recognize that that's not fair, right? And that we can't really be making decisions about people based on that. I think that body language can be used as a tool for people like detectives or intelligence people or whatever, who are working, maybe psychologists who are working in the field, because those things can give them a hint that might tell them, like, oh, this person might be lying, or, oh, maybe there's something else I should dig into here, or like, oh, it can give them a clue that there might be something there. But for us to be making like sweeping conclusions about who a person is, what their character is like, and whether or not they're lying while they have 10 cameras pointed at them, I don't think that's realistic or fair on any level.
Yeah, I agree. And I think another thing that I kind of pick up on a lot, unfortunately, is that maybe more across social media is people saying, well, there's still no evidence. David Grush has said all these things. There's still no evidence. But we know that he's sat down for over 10 hours with Congress and given all this evidence to them. And yes, it's not public, but, we've got to let these processes play out in the way that they've been set out and laid out. The whistleblower legislation that came into effect, this is what we're seeing coming in now, and unfortunately things take time. So I understand the frustrations, but what would you say to those people that just sit there behind their computers and desks and demand all the time? Yeah, because there's a lot to that that's very frustrating, right? I think the first part is people, when they're like, oh, there's no evidence, it's like there's heaps of evidence. I do this from the time I wake up to the time I go to bed, and I can't possibly keep up with it all. Like, there's so much evidence. Evidence is not proof, but enough evidence, corroborating evidence, you can put it together and you can start to tell a story. And you don't draw an absolute conclusion, right, until you feel like you have enough evidence, but you can start to conjecture about what might be going on here. And it's not crazy for those of us who have spent all of our time looking at the evidence to start to say, like, hey, it kind of looks like this, like, that's not insane. There may not be proof. They may not have like wheeled out the bodies, but that's the other thing, is that, like, let's say that at that hearing, David Grush had said, and here they are, and he had wheeled out a crashed UFO and a body on ice. Like, people wouldn't have believed that either. You know what I mean? Like I think we really need to think about what proof actually means, and what it's going to take for us to get to proof isn't going to be some like grand unveiling moment where we all get to see the body. It's going to be like the government and governments around the world doing their job, the people who are supposed to be doing this, digging into it, finding the paper trail, chasing it all down, figuring it out, and that's a big
process. The United States government is a multi-trillion-dollar organization that employs millions of people, and people expect it to like turn on a dime. It's like trying to, it's like you have to turn a cruise ship, and people want to do it in 60 seconds, you know, like it takes a minute to turn a cruise ship. Like you got to be patient. And I think the cruise ship is turning, and we just have to, you know, we need to keep the pressure on the people who need to be doing their jobs and who need to be investigating this. Like that's our role in this. But after that, we need to just calm down.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that's, you know, it's not only the job of the government to do their job, that is their job, but for researchers is to do their due diligence and to not just rush research and put information out publicly because people are just needing that next fix, because we live in a world where everything's almost instant these days. And, you know, that's what I try and keep in my head, because, you know, I've come across some of the best cases that I've researched are barely known. But then, you know, you can have testimony with radar data and things like that from the 50s and the 60s, you know, but it isn't necessarily the proof, and that's it. I don't think people always, you know, differentiate the two. And then you hear these people say, well, the government knows. And like you said, the government is millions of people. So let's have that conversation. Who in the government? You know, I think these broad terms are thrown around so often that it is frustrating to hear. I understand the frustration at the same time, but yeah, it's just, I guess that's just the times that we live in, really.
No, and I've been seeing,
go on.
No,
Sorry, go on.
I've been seeing so many people talk about Ross Coulthart with the big UFO, and they've been discouraged by some of the things that he's been saying about like, oh, we might not get another House hearing and that sort of thing. And they're like, well, why doesn't he just, I saw a whole thread on Reddit the other day that was just like, well, why doesn't he just tell us where the giant UFO is? And they're like, yeah, that'll do it. And I'm like, so what if he did? Like, are you guys going to walk up to a top secret government facility and like look in the window? Like, what would do nothing if he did that? I think it's just, people don't understand the process that we're dealing with here, you know?
Again, and that comes back to letting things play out as well, because, you know, a lot of us in this community have sources, and you can't just burn your sources for the whim of a few people online who just, you know, need that information right now. So I agree. But you mentioned something just previously about bodies and craft and that. So that made me think of a question which I've been meaning to ask more people is, if you had the choice to see one or the other, would it be the craft or the bodies?
Oh, I think ultimately it would be the bodies.
Ooh,
you know,
okay.
I think for us, I mean, technology is very cool, right? But I also feel like we kind of, especially for those of us who've been doing this, you know, and really gotten deep into it, I kind of have an idea of what they look like. I've seen one, you know, like but when we find a body, like the first time that we come across like something that is an intelligence that is not human, like that's going to tell us, we're going to, you know, we talked earlier about like how we're just putting things on the table all the time and we're never able to take them off. You know, we're going to be able to start to determine some things. And, you know, it seems from the reports of experiencers that like most of these things are humanoid in some fashion. Yeah. And I'm absolutely fascinated by that, because like, what does that mean? Like, are they intentionally looking humanoid because they're like drones of some kind and they need to look enough like us that we know that we can communicate with them, but enough not like us that like we know there's something else? Are they related to us in some way? You know, like, does DNA at a certain point just like produce certain body schemas? Like, is DNA something that's more universal? And, you know, there's a million questions that could be asked. And I don't know that like seeing the body would answer any of them for me, but it would just, I think it would be really, really cool. And it would, in some ways, we're going to be a different kind of species the first time we really slap our eyes on something that's not us, you know?
That's really interesting. And I see a lot of people in the live chat saying bodies as well. And I'm starting to kind of cringe a bit, because I was going to say the craft, which is interesting because I feel like, you know, these are the things that people are witnessing more than seeing the beings, let's say. So I was like, let's take step one for me would be, let's see the craft. And I feel once you get the craft, the bodies will follow. And maybe I'm just being optimistic there, but I just feel like it's a natural progression to work up to like, there's the objects, now let's see who's flying them kind of thing. That's kind of my process. Maybe if I went away and literally sat down for a lot longer, I'd probably think, no, actually, maybe the bodies and stuff. But that's
you might
really
be able to figure stuff out about the bodies, though. You might be able to like if you looked at an airplane and you had never seen a human before, like you might be able to figure out some things about, you know, like you would learn something about the bodies, I think, by looking at the craft. There would be some information you could draw. So, I mean, there could be an argument there.
There is there. Or maybe I'm just like a typical bloke and I just like, it's like a fancy Lamborghini or something and I just like fast things, and, you know.
Like David Fravor at the hearing, who was just like, I just want to fly one.
Exactly. Maybe I have that kind of narrow-minded mentality. But it's interesting. It's just an interesting thing to see the different kind of answers that people get. Here, Carolina in the chat saying bodies in the crafts. You see, I like that forward thinking. Well, listen, Kelly, before we finish, I really want to talk about your latest show that you put out, which is UFOs and High Strangeness, the 6-layer model by Vallee and Davis. Could you just, for anybody that isn't aware of that, could you just kind of break it down for us? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was an episode that kind of snuck up on me. I wasn't intending to do it, but because I'm rereading Skinwalkers at the Pentagon to get ready for that series, I'm really glad I stumbled across it because I think it serves as a really good sort of prologue to that story. Because it says in Skinwalkers at the Pentagon that this is the paper written by Jacques Vallee and Eric Davis that they actually used to sort of create the scope of and the structure of the investigations that they were going to do in OSAP, the predecessor of ATIP. So in a lot of ways, I found that really interesting. And so I wanted to dive into it. And I started reading this paper and I was like, oh my gosh, like this is explaining and putting together so many things for me in a really helpful way. So I wanted to put it out there. And like, there's a lot to it, but their main argument is they have this 6-layer model where they basically break down the impacts of and the effects of UAP sightings. And also like, so there's like the physical layer and the anti-physical layer, the psychological layer, the psychic layer, and the cultural layer. And so and basically what they're kind of arguing is that like you can't separate these things out. You know, you have somebody like Jacques Vallee, and they were also drawing from the NIDS database as well. I mean, they were drawing from like thousands and thousands of reports that had been like meticulously collected. And when you look at all these reports together, you can't throw out the high strangeness and still be talking about the same thing. Like UFO encounters are very weird. They're much weirder, I think, than even a lot of people in the community are really willing to deal with sometimes. You know, people are like, oh, I don't do that woo stuff. It's like, well, then you don't do ufology because like you really can't do ufology. And it took me a while to get there too. So I'm not saying that in a condescending way at all, but I think that we all have to get to that point where we realize like it doesn't matter if this makes you uncomfortable. It doesn't matter if you don't know what to do with it. Like this is the reality of the situation. And we can either continue to throw out the data points that we don't like and pretend that that's being objective, or we can look at the data points and we can say, okay, what does this mean? And we don't have a good answer for that, by the way. And something that Vallee and Davis argue for that I really appreciate is that at least for a while, we're probably going to have hypotheses that contradict each other. You know, like we have in physics, two of the most empirically successful theories that we have in physics are the theory of relativity and then the theory of quantum mechanics. And those two theories are incompatible with each other. And then even within quantum mechanics, like light can be a particle and light can be a wave. And those two ideas are incompatible with each other. And yet they both work with stunning accuracy. And so we have these things that contradict. And probably it's not that they actually contradict. Probably it's that our models are right enough, but like not quite right enough to put them together in a way that's coherent. And so that's probably the approach that we're going to have to get comfortable with UFOs, is that we're going to have a bunch of models that kind of mostly work, but they might conflict with each other. And that's still science, and that's still being objective, and it's being a lot more objective than throwing out the data points you don't like. And so the whole episode just kind of does a deep dive into all of that. And it was a lot of fun. And I really recommend people, you know, read that paper because it's a really, really good one.
I can't wait. I'm going to dig into it really soon. And I also look forward to the Skinwalker episodes that you're going to be doing as well. And I can't stress enough to everybody watching now, listening later, to please go to the links below and go and follow Kelly everywhere you can, because her work is absolutely phenomenal. And I think you'll all find a real home and take so much from it as well. But listen, Kelly, thank you so much. I've had an absolutely fascinating conversation. I knew it would be. It's always an absolute pleasure to see you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Vinny. And thank you to everybody watching. This was such a fun time. Thank you.
Thank you. To everyone in the live chat, as always, I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much. I'm going to be back next week with Ralph Blumenthal. We're going to dig into his kind of breaking story with Leslie Kane on the David Grush story and everything that's happened since, and maybe anything that he might be working on coming forward. But for now, everyone, thank you so much, and I'll see you next week. Take care.